Industrial agriculture is how we currently feed the world. And so it's easy to sit on a pedestal and talk about how bad industrial agriculture is, but the reality is that we still depend upon it, Michelle and I. And actually almost everybody on earth that I know depends upon it as well. And so it's really easy to be a critic if you don't have a solution to replace it with. But the reality is that we can't actually continue growing food the way that we have for the last 10,000 years. And it's really kind of sped up, in the last 50 with the agricultural revolution. There's a couple of there's more than a couple. There's a bunch of kind of primary reasons that industrial agriculture is going to have to change. And so the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, what are we going to transition into? So I'm going to talk about a few of these primary issues, and then I'll try and couple them with solutions. There's a growing body of scientists around the world that are raising alarm bells right now, saying that there's only about 60 crops left on planet Earth. So after, it could be anywhere from 30 to 60 years, depending on how many crops you actually get into your field on an annual basis. Some parts of the world you can crop twice and sometimes 3 times. Places like ours, we typically only get 1 crop off because our growing season is so short. And what they're basically talking about is background soil erosion rates that are occurring. And so one statistic I read in one of Richard Heinberg's books, Peak Everything, mentioned that 1 ton of grain currently erodes 7 tons of topsoil. So we're basically trading topsoil for grain. Now that doesn't mean that growing grain is necessarily bad. There's lots of ways to grow things, but the way that we're currently doing it, using herbicides and pesticides and fungicides and all the other sides that get placed onto these fields, is currently causing damage to our agricultural soils. And I probably won't remember the quote quite right, but I think it was Abraham Lincoln that said, nations that destroy their soils destroy themselves, something along those lines. And so that's one of the big issues. Another really big issue is that industrial agriculture depends heavily on external inputs. And so nitrogen fertilizer is one of them. Phosphorus is another one, potassium is another one. And these are exceptionally energy intensive inputs that we're placing into the soil. And so nitrogen usually comes from natural gas. And at some point we will run out of natural gas. It's hard to say exactly when that will be. Or natural gas prices are going to go up as we ship all of the natural gas in North America offshore. And that process occurs through the Haber-Bosch process. So natural gas is transformed into usually ammonia in the form of the Haber-Bosch process, which is then injected into the soil. And that creates all sorts of problems. Injecting an anhydrous ammonia into the soil creates a massive die-off of the microbes in the soil because it's anhydrous, so it absorbs water, and so it creates all sorts of microbial death in the soil. So it causes issues with microbial soil microbiology and biodiversity. The phosphorus issue is interesting. There is a limited amount of phosphorus on the planet. Most of it comes from China, Africa, and the United States. Both China and the United States have stopped exporting phosphorus. And so the last remaining country to export significant amounts of phosphorus is actually in Africa. And if you go, I think it's the New Scientific Journal, I'm not sure, I'll try and find the link and we put it in the show notes below, is postulating that we could run out of phosphorus as early as 2030. And one of the reasons that industrial agriculture depends upon all these nutrients is that they're growing monocultures. And so in this garden, which I'm sitting in right now, we've got nitrogen fixers, we've got animals that are on the farm and more animals to come. So we can bring manure into the garden. So they're converting biomass into phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium in the form of manure. And so that's a form of biodiversity, having both plants and animals coexisting together. And so we're managing our crops and our livestock in such a way that we don't have to have those inputs. And industrial agriculture could transform to do that as well. At one point, 100 years ago, farms were much smaller and they were mixed farms. And so they had pigs and chickens and cows and sheep, maybe not all of those animals, but they would have a diversity of animals and plants on a farm that would help to close that loop. And so as plants were mining materials out of the soil, the animals were consuming them and then defecating back onto the ground. And so there was a bit of a closed loop system there. Now we've got systems that are not closed loop, they're open loop, meaning that we buy seeds from some seed supplier, we plant them into the ground, we buy fertilizer from another supplier, we put that into the ground, and then when we're done, we actually harvest those seeds and we ship them off. And so now we've shipped all of that nutrient and all of those inputs off of the farm. And so there's an old farming saying that you should never sell anything off your farm that doesn't walk off your farm. And so this is the primary reason that moving humanity to a vegan and vegetarian world will never work, and actually depends entirely on an industrial agricultural concept. Basically, the saying, you should never sell anything off your farm that can't walk off your farm, is talking about the efficiency of the cow, or the lack thereof. The inefficiency of the cow, I should say, represents the efficiency of the land. And now what do I mean by that? Essentially, a cow might eat 100 kilograms of feed and it might drink 100 kilograms of water. 90% of what it eats and drinks is going to end up back on the land. Only 10% of it gets accumulated into its body. And some people say it's even less than 10%. And so on an annual basis, when you have livestock eating plants and drinking water off of your land, most of what they consume remains in that ecosystem, and it actually enhances the ecosystem. The act of the cow eating and drinking off that land actually completes the nutrient cycle, which is absolutely essential for any ecosystem to function. If you just had plants on planet Earth and you took away all of the animals, planet Earth wouldn't exist. If you took away all the plants and you just left all the animals, planet Earth wouldn't exist. And so our ecosystems depend upon a dynamic, synergistic relationship between plants and animals. And industrial agriculture has kind of looked at the growing of plants or the growing of animals in the same way that Ford looks at growing cars or building cars. And ecosystems just don't function that way. We cannot look at our farms and at our livestock systems as car factories. It just doesn't compute. And this is why industrial agriculture is coming to the end of its days, is because it's coming up against multiple hard stops that don't align with how ecosystems have evolved over the last 4.5 billion years. In addition to all of that, I mean, literally I could spend hours talking about this, and I do in our permaculture design course. We are actively, and I've never understood how anybody can rationalize this in their head, but we are literally covering our food with poisons. So insecticides, for example, are nerve toxins and hormone disruptors. And so we're literally, growing plants to eat that are covered in, and these are oats right here. And so it's not uncommon now in an industrial agricultural system to spray these grains with Roundup, or a desiccant, basically a herbicide, and then the whole plant will die, the whole field will die, and then we harvest that, and so these husks now are covered in Roundup. And then, a baker might get it, and there's definitely going to be Roundup residue on the grain itself. And I grew up in a bakery. We don't go and we don't wash the grain before we grind it and use it. It gets ground, and so any of that Roundup residue is going to end up on that flour or on those oats, and then we bake with it. And so whoever thought that spraying our food with chemicals that kill bugs and kill weeds and kill fungus, and then shipping it to market and having humans eat it, I'm not sure what they were thinking. It doesn't compute. It doesn't make any sense. And so we know that there are massive increases in cancer and diabetes and MS, and you guys know all of the other chronic diseases because they're prevalent in all of our news channels on a daily basis. To pretend like spraying our food with chemicals is not going to have repercussions is just naive. And so industrial agriculture is something we currently depend upon. There are fantastic solutions that will allow agriculture to evolve into the next revolution. So we've come through the industrial revolution, the agricultural revolution. Now we have to come through the regenerative agriculture revolution, and we actually have to transform the way that we grow food in a way that's good for us and that's good for the field, so that we don't ever have to repeat that statistic again, that there's only 60 crops left on planet Earth. If you're interested more in what regenerative agriculture is, I'll leave a link to that video up above. And if you're interested in understanding how to start growing your own food, I mean, that's part of the solution to all of this stuff, is actually starting to participate in the food system again. 100 years ago, almost everybody had backyard gardens. And so they would have nutrient-dense food on a daily and yearly basis. And so if you're interested in learning how to create your own ecosystems, how to grow your own food, how to preserve it, and how to complete that cycle in your own little system, you should check out our permaculture design course. I'll leave a link to that down below in the show notes. This really is a revolution, but it's a positive one. And if more of us just take a slightly larger role in the way that our food is grown, we can absolutely transform the planet to a much more beautiful place to live in a really short period of time. Thanks so much, guys. I'll see you in the next video.